Good day, everybody. Welcome to our June DALiM webinar. Today we're going to have Alex do a little presentation, and just as a reminder for GoToWebinar, if you need to increase the size of what you're seeing for your screen, at the top left you should have a little panel that shows you can zoom to a certain percentage. Also, if you have any questions, just type them into your GoToWebinar control panel. There's a questions area, just type them in there. We'll take a look at them. I'll be monitoring these during the webinar. If I feel they're a point that I should stop Alex for, I'll do that. Otherwise, we'll wait to the end of the webinar to cover those questions. So today, Alex is going to cover a little bit about basically the SetParamFromXML tool and some of the options that are in it. I think he did a webinar on this early this year, kind of covering some basics. He wanted to get more in detail, some more stuff he's found out in using the tool, since it's not a very well documented tool. So kind of going through some XPath stuff, showing everybody just some of the higher end functions of it and what can be done with it. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and pass over to Alex. I think he's got a lot of information here and want to make sure we get it all covered. So Alex, passing you the ball.
Okay, I can see it. So I'm sharing out my screen. Let me know when you can see me.
Yep, we can see you.
Hey, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex, and today I'll be discussing Twist XML integration. For those of you who aren't as familiar with XML, what it is it's basically a standard format for storing or transferring certain structured data. It was designed a lot for example, if you're building an application and you need to either transmit data to somewhere else or store it on the file system, you don't have to reinvent the wheel and build your own way of doing that. That way you can use XML, and that would also work with, for example, other applications. This is pretty widely used throughout the tech industry. A few good examples are Microsoft Word, if you're familiar with the docx format. Under the hood, that's essentially XML. Another big one is Adobe's XMP Metadata format, which under the hood that is also an extension of XML. So used out there a lot in the wild, and there are a lot of benefits, particularly to using it as for job ticketing or for metadata storage, both of which come into play with Twist. In particular, there's two real benefits. If you can, number one, reduce hard-coded logic. Unlike if you have an older workflow, maybe you have a set param from RE with just a ton of conditional logic. If it's this title, use this output intent. If it's this other title, use this output intent. By using XML job ticketing, you can reduce that amount of manual labor needed within the workflow there. And you can also increase interoperability with other applications. As I mentioned, XMP metadata is one example. You can also grab, for example, information from a web-based, XML-based XPI. So for today's presentation, what I'll be doing is taking you through, we'll start with the basics from the ground up of building and using an XML job ticket within Twist. We'll start from the very foundation of building a simple XML file and build all the way up to more complex examples, such as calling an API within Twist, or for example, using a more defined select with XPath to grab only certain information from an XML file. So as far as how XML is structured, it's good for storing any sort of structured data. I have an example here of maybe, let's say in this case, we're a magazine publisher, and we have a publication job ticket for some files we're going to be running through Twist. In an XML file, you would be able to store this information, or these elements as they're known in XML, in a hierarchy of sorts. So for example, here we have this is some of the data we might be storing. We've got at the top level, it's a publication job ticket that's encapsulating everything. Within that job ticket, you've got a title, name, an issue name, a pre-press contact email, maybe in a more advanced note, some advanced finishing options that are defined in there, such as UV coding or die cut that you might need to use to trigger certain events within a workflow. So what we'll do is I have a very basic job ticket here that's coded in XML, just as a starting place. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the XML, there are two things in here that aren't quite core to XML, but they're very important parts of this nonetheless. The first is this very first line of the file. Hopefully that is easy to read. If that's too small, let me know and I can bump up my text size. But
you may want to bump it up a little bit.
Sure thing. I think I can do that under for where that's hiding on me. Okay,
Yeah, there you go.
there we go. Bump that up to 14. Is that better?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay, cool. So basically, this first line here is what's called the prologue. It's not really a part of the XML data we're storing in this file. It's more metadata that explains to anything that's opening this file what it is. So it's basically just saying this is an XML file. It's using XML version 1.0, and it's encoded as a UTF-8 text encoding, or Unicode in this case. This isn't something that's mandatory. You don't need this for every XML file, but it's good practice to get into, particularly if you're dealing with multiple applications and they default to different encoding standards. Maybe you send something from Twist that's UTF-8, another application that's using ASCII, or UTF-16 tries to interpret it. You could wind up with some garbled data, so better to kind of define that explicitly. And in fact, there are some cases in Twist, I haven't tested it recently, but I know in some of the older versions of Twist, it really struggled with UTF-16, so better to define that up front and make sure there's some kind of a check in there in case you get something that isn't easily parsable. The second thing in here that isn't quite part of the XML data is these things here, these tags with the little exclamation point in front. These are just comments. These are just anything interpreting the XML doesn't care about them. They're just for visibility or readability purposes here. So I broke mine into different segments so that it's a little easier to read, so I'm not just looking at a wall of text here. Now, as far as the XML itself, it's all very structured by these things called elements. And an element is defined by a set of two tags, the tags being these things within brackets here. And basically, an element can just represent anything that I needed to represent. You always have one at the top that's the root element where it starts. In this case, my root element's named job ticket. It starts up here where I have this tag, and it ends down here where I have this other tag with the slash, which signifies the start and end of it. I should note that this job ticket, that's not anything that's defined in the XML standard. It doesn't really care what I put in here. What it only really cares about how I store it, not what I'm storing specifically. So you could put or really name anything in here, anything you wanted. So in this case here, I have a job ticket that's an element. Within that element, I can also store other elements, text, or attributes or more advanced features, which I don't have quite yet in this file. So for example here, this job ticket element has another element contained within it that is called title name. That title name has some text associated with the name of the title that I'm printing. My contact email, this is another element. That element also has some text contained within it. So you can store a lot of information like this in a pretty easy structured format and give some kind of semblance of order to it. Now, if I want to use this in Twist, what I can do is use the SetParamFromXML tool. I have a real basic workflow here that all it's going to do is just take the file in. It's going to run it through a SetParamFromXML tool that's set to fully automatic. But fully automatic, what it does is it looks at whatever files come into the workflow. It tries to see if there's any XML it can identify in there, and then it tries to grab it if it can. Then after that, we're just going to use a show memories to grab whatever's in the processes and hang in a validate so we can take a look at what Twist found. So uploading this now. So this file came in. If I take a look in here now, you'll see we have all our fields in the Twist table. We have our contact email, we have our output intent, we have our publisher names. All that information came in, and we can use that, if so desired, to drive a workflow. This can also be used in more complex examples because maybe you're not always dropping just an XML job ticket alone into a file. You want to use it in conjunction with a PDF or something else that you're processing. Let me find, I think I have one here. This is one example of an easy way to do that. So really simple pre-press workflow here. The way this is set up, it looks to see if a file is coming in, if it's XML or if it's something else like a PDF or PostScript. And what happens is if it's a PDF, it just stashes it in a folder and ends the work, stops running through the workflow. If it's an XML file, it comes down this branch, it processes through the SetParamFromXML and grabs all the information in there. Then it hangs it this wait on. And what this wait on is set to do is it waits for a PDF at the stash location up here. When one arrives, then what will happen is it'll pull it into process and run it through the workflow, retaining all the data that we pulled out of the XML a little earlier in the workflow. So if I dump something in here, let me dump in, here they're looking for things that are given the same name. So I have a demo corp mailer here. So if I dump in just the XML here, what we'll see is that this is going to come in, and it's going to wait for PDF. So I'm just waiting there. Now if I dump that PDF in, I think this is, there we go. Too many things named the same. What happens when that PDF comes in, we'll see in a moment, it's going to go in, it's going to stash it in that folder. Now this process over here, that's going to change very briefly from XML to PDF. What that means essentially is we got the XML data we needed out of that XML file, we dumped it, and we took the PDF that was in that folder to use as our in-process file instead. And then if we wanted to, we could use the data in that XML file to transform or to change what we're doing in the workflow. One other way this can be used is, for example, with a web-based API. Maybe you've got a MIS system or something else in your kind of corporate IT systems that you want to grab some information from and use in Twist. For example, maybe use some job planning information. This tool does have the ability to grab either from external files or from the web, such as a web-based API. I set up a little mock-up here a little earlier. I'm just running it on Apache on one of my machines in my home. And so it's just, this isn't really like a full API here, but I just have a folder with some XML job tickets named after the job number. But what happens is I have this API workflow here. What that's going to do is when it comes in, if I go into SetParamFromXML Options, there's a regular expression search here, where what it's going to do is it's going to look at the file name, and if it can pull out a job number signified by that J followed by one or more digits, then it's going to take that and it's going to add that into this string here and try and look for an XML file there. So if I go in here now and drag in, I have my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 test. Now when I look at this in the process log, you'll see I have my PDF in here. It went out to that web address, which is on a separate machine from my Twist server, and it pulled all the information off of that XML that was online on my API. So some more ways you can use that. And the benefit of that too with the file system is, for example, maybe you've got different settings for you, 4 or 5 titles that you want to use different settings for. Rather than have a set param from RE that says if it's this title code, use these settings where you'd have to maintain that in multiple workflows. You could even just have XML on your file system on your Twist server, so that named after that pub code, so that that way it can look in there and grab that information. So you don't need to maintain that in 4 or 5 workflows. You can maintain that just in that one file and reuse that in whatever workflows you need it to. So that's about the basics of how that basic extraction mode works. It looks for any XML that it can find in a file. If it can find it, it extracts it. If it can't, then it just ignores it. So this is where you kind of run into some roadblocks with the basic approach. Is I have another ticket here that it's all at the start the same as the one that we had before, except there's this new element down here called finishing options. And this finishing options element has 2 other elements under it. These are both named option. So there's 2, they're both the same named element. These have, rather than text, they're storing what are called attributes. And the attributes are signified by this, that's the name of the attribute and the value of the attribute. So for example, this option is, its key attribute is UV code, and its value attribute is true. In this case, it's saying that's an option is UV code options on this job, and it's set to true. This is for a case like this, maybe you don't want to have to manually name all the finishing options or organize them loose out here. You can keep them all clustered together so that you have a little less kind of cruft in that file. But the problem with this is if I take this and I try and dump this into Twist here, actually it's the wrong workflow there. Getting ahead of myself here. Dump that back into here. Now you'll see here that it came in, it grabbed a lot of the information it could grab, so it got the title name, the publisher, all that information, but it didn't grab these new finishing options down here. It went through all these and saw, okay, I think that's the variable name, this title name here, I think that's the contents of that variable. It did that, it got down here, this was a little more complex, wasn't sure what to do with it, so it skipped it. So what you can do in this case is there are some more options within SetParamFromXML that you can use to control what kind of information you're grabbing specifically. Lost my window here. So if I go in here, I can change the extraction mode from automatic to either manual or expert. Manual we'll go with now. And what this is going to allow you to do is it'll show you a little facsimile of if you have a test XML file that's like the data you're going to be running, and then you can basically define rules to grab, to define what you want to select out of that XML. So in this case, let me grab my ticket here. I think I have a process log open just for reference. So the way this works is in this tool you can build rules to set what you want to put into your twist table. And there's three real things you're going for here. And they're not related to anything in the XML. The first is a category, and that's what area of the twist table is this being stored in. It could be variables, it could be original file, you could name it whatever you wanted really. The property would be the variable name. So property, for example, might be ICC profile here. Then the value would be what is the value of that variable in the twist table. In that case, for the ICC profile, you've got your coded Grackle 2006. So that's really, you can define each of those. They don't have to be tied to anything specific in the XML. Now, as far as how that works within SetParamFromXML here, you have a button over here that lets you do one of two things for each of these rules. You can either set it as a constant, or you can set it as to use XPath. And if it's a constant, it just uses whatever you put in this field. So I type variables or whatever I type in there. It's not going to look at the XML. It's just going to use whatever I type in here, which is useful for maybe I don't need to grab the category out of the file. So I'll just let that be as is. If I click this button and fill that in, then it becomes evaluated as XPath. And XPath is basically, it's a language or a way of describing a very specific element within this XML file. So you can kind of zero in. It's basically directions for Twist to say, okay, I want you to grab the thing at this location in the XML file. So, and then you have a few more options for example, if you have multiple results, how do you want to handle those? Do you want them all as a list? Do you want them all as just all results, only the first result? You can control those a little more. So if I want to set these up, for example, for, let's just do the contact email. Twist can help you build XML or XPath so that you don't have to create it yourself. It selects everything in this XML file, kind of highlights what it detects as XML in here, and I can click on one of these, for example. Let me go with the, actually I have to create a new rule down here. I can click on one of these, for example, the contact email, and add it as either XPath as a category, a property, or a value. Here I'll go with, I want that to be my property, so I'll set that as the property there. And now I'll set this email itself as the value. So I like how that looks. If I go ahead and save that, and I drop this in, what we'll see this time is it grabbed my contact email. It didn't grab anything else from the file, just what I defined for it to grab. You can get a little more tricky in here too. For example, if, let me go to my finishing options. I'm going to set that back to variables here. So, for example, maybe I want to grab these finishing options because I couldn't get those earlier. I can go in here, I'll make two different rules. I'll set this one as well. I'll set this key as my property and this value as my value. I'll make a second rule for the die cut down here. So I have basically defined what this is saying is that that @ means it's a key here, or an attribute here that I'm dealing with rather than text or an element. This is basically just the full path, kind of like a file system path might look through the whole XML. So you've got your job ticket, your finishing options. So it's basically selecting the key from the second option element within the first finishing options element within my job ticket. And for the value, it's selecting the value attribute for the second option element within my first finishing options element within my job ticket. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And if I run this again now, then what I'll get this time is I'm going to get a process log that has my two variables. So you can see I have die cuts false, UV code is set to true. But the way that's set right now, that's very absolute. I'm only grabbing elements based on their position in the file, which can be a problem. For example, I have another variant in this file here that has two new options in front. So I've got my UV coat and my die cut, but I've got bind type and inkjet also listed in here as specific finishing options. So what will happen here is, let's see what happens if I dump this in, is I'm only going to get the first two options, and I'm not going to get anything else than I wanted in there. I'm not going to get that whole list of finishing options, which this is a problem we've seen a few customers run into, particularly if you're dealing with XML that's either generated from another application, or you have another customer that's generating it to their specifications, and you're trying to figure out how to get this very specific information out of a more complex file. You can see here we got our bind type and our inkjet variables, but we didn't get the die cut or the UV coat variables that we wanted. So how would you handle a situation like that? What we could do in here is, let me pop in here again. If we go over to expert mode, then what we get here is there's a new field that pops up here called subset selector. And what subset selector allows you to do is to hone in on a specific portion of the file, which the main reason that's special in Twist is because it gives you an option on how to handle multiple subsets. I can set them to fork, for example, maybe if I have different lists of job options or different values there, maybe I have different two different output formats I need to generate, both an X1A and an X3, I can set it to fork on multiple results so it would generate two files. Or I can set it to do not fork and just keep one process and keep all the values. Or just truncate and keep only the first one I get if I'm not too picky about the information I'm grabbing. But in this case, what I'll do is I'll set my subset selector. Let me actually get rid of one of my redundant rules down here. I'll set my subset to option. So if I go down here, now I have a new option and I'm in expert mode. Set XPath as subset selector. And what you'll see down here is, actually I missed one thing here. For this I have to suggest XPath with multiple results. Let me actually reopen that tool here. That's one thing by default it tends to, let me reset this here. Yeah, by default it tends to default to show you only XPath with a single result so that you don't get too much information. But if you're in a case where you do want multiple results, it's a little more handy to have that kind of extra leeway there. So let me grab this file. I'm going to set my subset selector to option. I'm just going to put a rule in here too. So you can see I have this time, I got my 4 options as my subset here. So set this to variables for the category. What I'll do in here is I'll select my key and my value as the property. Now what will happen in here is now, that's going to, for each of these, I'm going to set it to not fork, but for each of these, I'm going to count them as 4 separate things. And for each of those, it's going to grab the key and the value for each of those. So if I resave this and run this again, I'll actually run both my files. Let me grab both of these. Those are crunched in. We'll see this one has all 4 values. So we got all 4 of our variables. This one we got all 2 of the variables. And it's a lot simpler than what we were configuring before with that single result option only and with some of the more static settings that we had in there before. Now as far as how this, let me actually set this back to default again. As far as the different kind of statements, because it doesn't always give you the most effective way of defining something in this tool. So what you can do is there's different ways that these paths work. They're basically sort of like a file path or web path. You've got that hierarchy starting with job ticket. You've got your finishing options, you basically drill down on the path using this XPath to get to what you want to get to. But there are three different ways you could get to, for example, if we wanted to grab one of the finishing options here, there's three different ways we could define a route to that path. The first is by using a single slash. So if I wanted to grab this option, I should add my rule again. There's my property. So I could have something where I have job ticket finishing options option and define it out very, it's again full basically. But maybe I'm in a situation where the XML that comes in is a little more variable. I don't care about this whole hierarchy, or I don't want to type the whole thing, or I'm too afraid of making that so absolute. You can also do relative paths to an element. So those would work if those paths start with 2 slashes. So for example, here I can get rid of the whole job ticket portion and just do it this way. So I get to that finishing options by able to search for the element that's named finishing options without going through the whole hierarchy that I gave it. So a little more flexibility there. Even for example, I could just set that to just option, and it's going to find my option that way so that I don't need to type the whole path. And the last is for when you're using a subset selector. So for example, if I zero in and use the option as my subset here, I could set this to use, for example, the dot there to say start from the current element that I'm at. And then, for example, look for the key underneath that. So there's a few different ways you can reference, and then that would take this whole path up here, start with this, and then just kind of tack this onto the end so that again, I don't have to type so much, and that still retains the specificity of this absolute path here. So one thing that's worth noting with this is that this uses XPath 1. There is an XPath 2, which I think is a little newer, which has some more features to make it a little easier to extract more complex metadata. But unfortunately, that's not in this tool yet. So sometimes if you're searching online for something about XPath and you're trying to find, you find an example that looks pretty slick and doesn't work, make sure that it's not XPath 2, because I know I certainly burned myself with that one afternoon. So that's about the gist of that. Now, let's say we want to do a little more complex of an example, kind of bringing this all together. How that would work is I have one workflow here, actually have a file too. It's on my Webbased API named after my job number. So we have the same XML ticket we've been using this whole time so far. However, what I did this time is you have the initial bit up front. So you have your just, I guess, data about the file, what title you're running. But then under that, this is split into 2 printers, Mr. Print and Litho King here, and they each have their own separate prepress specs and, for example, different PDF output formats, different output intents, and completely different finishing options because they might have different presses. Now, what we could do in this case, this is more of a trick to use, and I wouldn't really recommend implementing it quite this way, but if you're in a situation where a client or another application is giving you XML formatted like this, and you need to find a way to work with it in a pinch, you could do something like this workflow that I built here. And what this workflow is going to do to look at this is it's going to do a few different things to kind of drill down through this. Unfortunately, there's no real way to handle all of this in one SetParamFromXML. You have to use 2 or 3 or 4 depending on what layers you're drilling down to. So in this case, what I do is I have one initial SetParamFromXML here that searches through my document and tries to find the name of any printers that are in that document. It's set to fork when it finds multiples. So what will happen is it'll come in here, the file, it'll split into multiple processes, one for each printer that I need to deliver to, and then over here what it'll do is it's going to use this SetParamFromXML to override my subset selector in these following 2. There's no way, for example, with the subset selector to just use a variable in here, unfortunately. So you have to overload it using a setParam from RE like this. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just calling, setting that subset to my job ticket, the printer, where the name attribute matches whatever printer name I pulled out of the XML earlier, and then dialing that down through the finishing options to the options as the subset. That's going to grab all those options, and it's also going to grab, the second one down here is going to grab all the prepress information that's not in that finishing options area. then the setParam from RE here is going to use those values to overload the values in my OPDF here. So I've got a file here that I can use for this example, this one right here. So what this is going to do is the file's coming in now. And what happens is you see we got two forks in here. I have them actually set to hang and validate. We can see if we go to our show memories here, this one came in. The printer is Mr. Print. We have all our options for Mr. Print, the MP options here. We have our PDF is set to X1A. If I go to the second one, you'll see that our printer is set to LithoKing. We have all the LithoKing options down here, and they're going to get an X3. So what happened now is if I take these two files and I validate them, it's going to go through my OPDF and actually pop them in an output directory for me. So if I go over here, you'll see I have folders for LithoKing and Mr. Print. So if I pop these open in Acrobat and take a look, this one is an X3. And if I open it up in Output Preview, you'll see that this is using Grackle. And now the second one down here, if I look at this one you'll see is an X1A. And if I open this one up in Output Preview, I have a faux gras file. So really complex stuff you can do with a relatively simple XML file. Again, not the cleanest in here because you've used so many tools, but considering you can still get a surprising amount of specificity from such a relatively simple XML file. So there's one more example I'll show you too real quick, is that this is also useful for XMP metadata, as I mentioned, from Adobe. So in that case, if I go back to my basic one, let me reset this to factory settings here. So what would happen in this case is if I have just a random PDF in here, any of these will do. Let's pull this one in here. What we'll see is if that runs through a SetParamFromXML, that has embedded XML metadata in there in the form of XMP data. So this comes in, this PDF, it's going to look in the PDF itself, and it's going to find that embedded data. So you can see that this was created with Adobe PDF library. It's an X1A. I don't think this one has my name in it as an author, but you can grab a lot of information out of that file and use that to some very, very useful means. One example of this, I showed this during my January webinar. I'll just kind of breeze through it right now. If you want to see a little more detail about how I set this up, do check out our January 2016 Twist webinar. It's on YouTube. But basically what this workflow is doing is, if maybe you have a folder with maybe 70, 80, maybe 500 just odd files that were lying around maybe on a network share, and I want to get them to some semblance of order so I can sift through them and find out if there's something I care about. This workflow can help with that. So I have a folder here with about 80 files. Let me dump all of these into this workflow and actually pop over here so we can see if we get output. So what this workflow is going to be doing is, as these files come in, it's going to look on if it's an XMP file, for example, because one of the problems we run into with stuff like this is maybe the metadata is not in the file in the event of, for example, a camera raw file where you've got a sidecar XMP file. If it's an XMP file, it's going to stash it on the file system in a certain location. And if it's a raw file coming in, it's going to go to this wait on just to kind of stall 2 or 3 minutes to let an XMP file or sidecar file pull in. Now, if it's otherwise, it's just going to continue on in any case to the SetParamFromXML. This is set to automatic extraction. It's set to look for a file on the file system in my XMP stash location. If it finds something there, it's going to use that. If not, it's going to fall back on the information in the any XMP or XML data that it can find in the PDF itself. It's going to come in here, it's going to set some transmit path to basically sort these files into folders based on their file type and the author if it exists in the metadata. It also looks at the metadata for the ISO speed for images, and if it's like ISO 400, I think, or higher, it rates it based on that film speed rating. So we know maybe if it's a 1, if it's like an 800 or higher ISO file, it's going to be really grainy. We don't want to use that in a publication. So that's what we can do here is, if I look in this folder now, we can see these files trickled through. So for example, my PDFs, you can see I have some in here. I have JPEG. Some of them that have an author in the metadata have an extra folder with my name on it. If they don't, they just got filed into the most specific point in the hierarchy they could. InDesign coming in, HTML. And what's actually really interesting is docx. It can find out from a Word doc, because these are all XML based too, and these do contain XMP metadata. For example, if you Word on your computer when you registered it with your name, it keeps track of your name as your author and inserts that in any Word docs you create. So if you've got Word docs lying out on a share somewhere, they have that XMP metadata built in. Twist can sort and handle those too. So just some really cool things you can do in there. Now, as far as one other thing I wanted to mention real quick too, as far as metadata is to watch out for, is under options. We've seen some cases where, for example, if you have like a PDF, Adobe tends to like to store thumbnails within that XMP metadata just as binary data, which that's generally okay, but that can cause issues if you're trying to extract that within Twist. So one of the things you can watch out for here is this Exclude Huge values option and the Include PDF tagged information options. I think there's a known bug with this one, but if you have a thumbnail come in, sometimes that can cause it to error out of SetParamFromXML. So if you're getting an error, try toggling these two options, and that may help with the extraction if you're getting some odd results there. So that's about the gist of XML use within Twist itself. Before we wrap up, I did want to include or cover, there are a few different resources you can use if you're trying to absorb all this information about XML. It's a bit like drinking from a fire hose. So the first is, if you're the kind of person who wants to play around with this and you're not the kind to crack open a text editor and dig in, one thing I like, it is a paid app, but one thing I do like is Oxygen, which is an XML editor where you can just drag and drop. For example, I built my little schema in here, so I have all the things from my example earlier. You can just drag and drop, and you don't have to do them in a text file manually. Once you create that, you can also build off of that and just kind of set stuff up in here in more of a spreadsheet format. So again, you're not worrying about unbalanced tags or anything like that. The second resource is if you're trying to either validate XML or get a little more comfortable with XPath syntax. The one thing that's really useful is this program called XML Lint. This ships by default on, let me make my text a little bigger here if I can, so you guys can see this when it comes up. XML Lint is a command line tool. It ships on most Macs and Linux servers by default, and it can be used to validate or parse XML in the command line, just if you're trying to get the hang of it. So for example, here, if I go to, let me cd to desktop webinar, I can just start it by typing XML Lint and basic ticket. And if my file is good, it's just going to show me the information that was in that XML file. However, if I go back in here, let's say I made a typo and I missed one of my closing brackets for this tag. When I look at that this time, it'll try to parse that XML. And this time I get an error saying around line 10, it's not finding the closing bracket for that tag. So that's one way you can tell exactly if you're having problems parsing something in Twist. It's a really useful resource for trying to dial in and figure out what's gone wrong there. As another example, let's say maybe I accidentally capitalized, since XML is case sensitive, maybe I accidentally capitalized my second contact email here. Now if I try and run it again, I'll see I get an error on line 8, parser error, my tags do not match. The two other things this is really useful for if you're trying to get the hang of XPath. This does have basically an XPath explorer of sorts built in. So I can type in XML Lint, I'll type in shell, and let's do multiple printers. So what I can do in here is it's like a normal file system. I can ls if I want, or just XPath star, and it'll show me all the elements under my current path. If I want to dig a little deeper and explore this file without seeing that huge wall of text in my text editor, so I'll cd into job ticket, for example, XPath star, and I can see all the elements and attributes in my XML file in more of a browsing kind of format. So really powerful tool there. The one last thing I like this for is if you need to check something real quick, there is a option to just do XPath evaluation on the command line here. So I have XML Lint, XPath. Let's do, maybe if I wanted to grab just the text name for the printers here. So you can see we got the names for both of the printers here. if I want to do something more complex, like grab the, I think I have one example over here. Yeah, here's one example that's, so find the printer where the name is equal to Mr. Print. And this time, for example, I found all the finishing options for the printer that had the attribute name that matched Mr. Print. So you can, if you need to test that and you don't want to deal with the SetParamFromXML itself, that's another way you can kind of familiarize yourself with these files, troubleshoot them, or just become more familiar with the syntax. So that's about the gist of running a little low on time. I don't think there's too much I can do with exporting XML, but that's about the gist of using XML within Twist to drive workflow and troubleshooting any issues you might encounter with XML. With that, any questions?
Yeah, there's a couple. Thanks, Alex. That was very thorough. You actually covered a few of the questions that did get asked. But I'll kind of sort through these really quickly since we are running kind of late. And see, could you quickly explain the difference between XMP and XML?
Sure thing. As far as XMP is, it's just a kind of subset of XML. Like I think I have a file here somewhere I can show. Yeah, if I go in here, I have a few XMP files. So I open one of these in my text editor. You'll see it's still using the same XML format. You've got your tags that are nested. So XMP is just basically a schema or a plan that was built off of that XML specification to serve the very specific purpose of file metadata for graphics applications.
Okay. All right. Could you, let's see, explain the difference between manual and expert mode options?
Sure thing. The only difference between the manual and expert mode is the presence of the subset selector. If I go back into one of these, if I turn this into manual mode, it's going to yell at me. Yeah, sometimes it gets a little cranky if you have options in there and you toggle between these too much. So as far as manual mode and expert mode, manual mode lets me just set the category, property, and value for anything I want to pull out of that XML file. The expert mode gives me the additional benefit of a subset selector, so I can hone in on a specific element of that file just as my starting point to fork a file, for example, so I don't have to be as specific down here, and I also have a little more control over forking that or how I handle that data once I get down to that nitty-gritty level.
All right. Let's see. I think you covered this, but I don't know if Mike Moscato's on the line, but the question about the Exclude Huge option and whether there is still a bug there or if that's been fixed recently.
Yeah, I think that's still in there. I'll have to check, but the option that question is referring to is what I was pointing to here. It's exclude huge values. That's supposed to identify, for example, if there's something larger than 1K, like you've got a thumbnail, it's supposed to exclude that from the XML extraction, but we run into some issues where that can cause the tool to reject.
Yeah, I can't say I've noticed that as being any in fixed issues lately.
Yeah.
And
thankfully,
then the
that's one that doesn't crop up too much.
Right. And I think the last one that we'll go over is what are the options with Twist to write XML out? I think you started to say something, but
yeah, this is one of those things that unfortunately I didn't have too much time to really dig into this today. But there is no XML out tool by default in Twist. The one thing there is the insert metadata tool, which can be used to write either embedded XMP metadata or let me see if I can find where that tool is hiding on me. I got too many tools in here. I can't see it. Anyway, there's an insert metadata tool.
Not mistaken, no.
Actually, I have it in my workflow here. I can just pull that up. Yeah, the insert metadata tool is what can be used to define metadata within a file, and that's XMP metadata, which is a subset of XML. You can either embed that within a file, or you can use that as a kind of sidecar thing. There is no pure XML export tool, but what you can do in that sort of case is if you wanted to, you could set up placeholder values, have something on your file system somewhere in your Twist server. So you have just placeholder 1. Then you just have a bash script that would go through, and you could use something like sed or awk to basically take that, and I think the syntax would be like sed s to replace, and then you could have your variable here. And what that would do is basically you could build a bash script that does that and call that from within a SetParamFromRe to sub out your placeholders with whatever values you're sending out a Twist and generate that XML.
Great. And I want to take the ball back. And well, thanks again, Alex. I think that was a very thorough run through. I think I'll use this video probably for my own reference because I don't get to play with it as much as you guys do. So I always get lost in those settings when I'm trying to do stuff. So thanks for that. Thanks everybody for joining us today. And just as a reminder, we do these webinars on the third Wednesday of every month. You can see the schedule for that on the BlanchardSystems.com website under the events page. They should be listed in there. When we get the details of what we're going to cover, we do put the information in, and you can register straight from the link on the website. We also send reminders out during the month that the event's coming up, who's going to be doing it, what will be covered. If you have specific information you would like to see covered for next month, hopefully I'll be doing some ES5 specific, maybe plugin specific if I can get the plugins from Frederick in time. If not, you're welcome to send us suggestions if you'd like to see us cover something, and we'll be happy to go over those. If you think any questions for Alex or us on the topic we just covered, happy to mail them to text@blanchard.com, and we'll get those covered for you. So again, everybody have a great day. Have a great rest of the week.